Hello and welcome to our live webcast, a clear view of your procurement horizons, highlights from this year's conference in Arizona. We thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Wilson, and I'll be the operator for our presentation today. Now, before we get underway, I'd like to take just a few moments to acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume settings that you may have. Also, a feature that we encourage you to use is to send in a question to our presenter. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the text chat window. There's a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the bottom where you can type in any questions or comments you may have. To send in a question, click that text box, type your text, and when finished, click the send button. All questions that you submit are only seen by our presenters, and your questions will be responded to verbally as time permits during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We are joined today by our speaker, John Hanson, editor and lead writer for Procurement Highlights. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to John Hanson. And John, welcome. The audience is all yours.
Well, thank you, Tim. And, I have to tell you something right off the bat. Procurement Insights, just to let you know, that's the name of the blog. And want to just touch on a couple of things about today's presentation. It's going to be very much an interactive session. In other words, I'm not going to pontificate from the podium and just espouse my thoughts and ideas. We're actually going to have a few polls. We even have a video in here. So I encourage you to ask questions. Much as Tim suggested, that venue is available to you. Right now up on the screen, you can see my history. I won't read it to you. I'll give you a minute just to look it over, give you a little bit of idea of my background in terms of what I do and my involvement in the procurement industry. Now, a couple of things I want to remind you of, and the next slide will be coming up. Following or immediately following this session, we will have on Twitter a tweet chat. Now, I don't know if any of you have been involved with the tweet chat before, but it'll give us an opportunity to engage those who may not have been able to participate in today's conference and get more specific in terms of their interaction. There'll be our usual notable or usual suspects in my procurement group, where we're all part of a posse, I guess, where you'll be able to bang ideas off them as well in 144 characters or less. Now, the Twitter tweet chat handle will be the hashtag Horizon16Chat. So just to remind you, immediately following, if you can hang around there, the first chat question will be posed at around 12:35. Now, let's move ahead. I'm sure you've probably absorbed enough of my background. Now, again, in terms of one question that just popped up, can you join it outside of Twitter? Unfortunately, the chat discussion is only available through Twitter, hence the tweet chat. But certainly, I'd encourage you to avail yourself of the Q&A here if you can't join us then. Now, let's go to the next slide. And again, there's the Horizon 16 tweet chat thing. Remember that. And the agenda, the focus that we're going to talk about today. And there's really three key areas. The first is how values of a procurement technology vendor trump technology in a commoditized cloud. The second is how the role of a procurement professional has elevated over the years from executive to an advisor. And it's an interesting distinction in terms of that. And you probably have your own ideas in regard to what that means. And then finally, I'm going to share with you some of the highlights, at least two of the highlights from the Horizon 2016 conference. One which poses the question was presented by Philip Eidson that raised the question, is a procurement profession going extinct? And then another one that was based on the Gartner presentation that talked about the impact of blockchain on the procurement world. And so, again, we'll go into some of those highlights as well. And again, to remind you, there'll be some polls along each stage of the way. We'll give you a few minutes to answer those and share some of your thoughts. Now, going forward, commoditized cloud. What is a commoditized cloud? Now, the image I use here, you can see it's cloning. But if I was standing before, I'd ask you, how many of you remember the early days of the PC when it first came out? I remember the Apple II, for example. It was a $13,000 unit. It had 10 megabytes of, not gigabytes, megabytes hard drive space, which at the time everyone said would be all anyone would ever need. It had a green phosphorus screen and a dot matrix printer. And it basically cost $13,000. Think about that. $13,000, especially in relation to today's value. Today, a PC you can get And you can literally buy them for a couple of $100s. In fact, a lot of them are disposable, just like those printers. In fact, just the other day, I picked up a printer for $39, had scanning capabilities. The features were far more advanced than they ever were back at the dot matrix, albeit, though, that the real value or the real income that's generated isn't out of the sale of the unit itself, but the ink cartridges that go into there. But my point is this, is everything in technology ultimately progresses to a commoditized state. And that means that the costs go down. That means that the accessibility becomes greater, and the comfort by which people use it is really interesting, because there's no longer this competitive distinction. There's no longer this focus on features, functions, and benefits. You know, if you look at, for example, the first calculator I ever bought, which was a Hewlett-Packard calculator, I paid almost $300 for that. How much do you pay for a calculator now, if at all? You can do it online. The phones you use. I have a Galaxy, not a 7 that starts on fire, mind you, but the Galaxy 5, and my wife has an iPhone. And, you know, if you look at both of those, whichever one you have, they both take make calls, they both take pictures, they both basically give you the same capabilities. And my point here is the competitive difference is no longer in the technology itself. Or to put it another way, and I've said this before, whether you get Zycus, Coupa, Ariba, anyone else, the technology is not the determining factor. There's another thing that goes on behind that. And that leads, and I'm going to advance to the next slide, that leads to my first poll, and I'll get into details, but I want you to answer this. If it comes down to one tipping point factor when choosing the e-procurement solution partner, which one would you choose? Which is the factor for you? Is it going to be a publicly traded company with big valuation, familiar and comfortable brand? You don't remember the old days? No one ever got fired for buying IBM. Now that'll resonate with some of you who've been around a little while, but nonetheless, we understand that. Client success and track record, and I'm seeing the results starting to come in now, and I'm going to touch on that momentarily. Connection and comfort with sales process, and then other. And maybe for those who select other, you could certainly use the Q&A to give me an idea as to what you think that other is. But I'll give you a few minutes to just respond to that, but I'll elaborate a little bit while you're doing that, in terms of what I mean by selecting a company, and that you couldn't go wrong if you purchased or selected Zycus or any of the other vendors. The technology itself in a commoditized cloud means that it works. And so you have to go beyond the technology, and you have to look at the people in the organization behind the cloud, or behind the technology, and what's operating the cloud. Who are the people with whom you're working? And I'm going to show you an interesting slide that I tweeted out while watching the CEO of Zycus give his opening remarks to Horizon 2016, because it does have a direct impact, believe it or not, on client success and track record. So I'll give everybody a few moments more without my voice in the background to respond to this poll. Well, and we should probably encourage everyone to know that there is no wrong answer, right? Would that be a fair statement, Tim?
I would think so. And participation is anonymous, so it looks like pretty much everybody who's going to participate has. Why don't we close the poll and share the results? Overwhelming.
Absolutely.
Client success track record.
At 66.8% said client success and track record was a key factor. So let me just ask this question in terms of that. How do you know what's that client success factor based on? That's a consideration you have to look at. Not only just confirming what the success factor is about, because let's face it, historically in the procurement world, and I'm going back over the data of the last 15 years or so, 20 years, more than 80% of all e-procurement initiatives, technology initiatives, failed to achieve the results that they were hoping to achieve. Now, this is before the emergence of the cloud, so I don't want to digress too much into the history as to what those statistics are. So client successes are based upon something. Is it a technological interest? Is it just the technology alone? Or if all things being equal, what might it be? And I think as we move to the next slide, this may be a clue to it. During the presentation, the Zycus CEO said, we are a private company focusing on customers. And I took away from that, and it was very interesting because I've written some articles in Procurement Insights about Zycus, is that no VCs or Wall Street equals a big customer win. Now, you see, that's an interesting perspective because he didn't talk about the technology. He didn't talk about being a publicly traded company. He didn't talk about anything other than the fact that they are focused on one single thing, customers. And you'll find that that is the characteristic of the emerging technology companies, the future titans of the industry, as I'll call them, because they're not being encumbered by having to meet a Wall Street earnings speculation or target. They're not encumbered by VC interest, which is to extract as much return value on their investment. And I'm going to take it to the next slide because what was interesting there is in the follow-up session to that, which was a P2P success panel discussion, one of the questions that was asked is, why did you choose Zycus? And the answer, global nature and good to work with. Again, no reference to technology. And I think that is a compelling argument or point relative to the commoditization of the cloud. The fact is when you select someone to get to the level of client satisfaction, to drill down behind your answer, because, customer and client success is key. What drives that success? Is it the technology or is it the people doing the implementation? I'm going to digress one more minute before we go on to the next slide. I remember speaking in front of an audience of giving a keynote presentation, and at the following my presentation, a member of CGI came up to me and they said, you said, why do e-procurement initiatives fail? She told me, and she was involved actively in implementations, is most organizations have an A team that they use to sell the technology or the idea or the vision. And as soon as they land that business, they move on to the next opportunity to generate sales. And then the B team comes in, and there may not necessarily be as well versed. And that's really spoke to me at that point. This was many years ago. Is the fact is when you look at an organization, look beyond the technology, look at the people, what their focus is behind the scenes, and what is their implementation capability. That's what's ultimately going to impact or influence the outcome of your selection. So just something to keep in mind, and that was, again, one of the most interesting elements to it. So I close by saying this first section, technology becomes ineffective the more dependent we become on it. Now, that's an interesting thing. So when we talk about being leading edge, we can't just think about, and you can read the quote in its full, as it's up there on the screen. But when we talk about technology, what we're really saying is leading edge is not in the technology itself, but it's in the people behind the technology. And it's the people behind the organization, this new commoditized cloud, that you have to assess their implementation capabilities, their capabilities to team up with you and put together a strategy of implementation that will work. But the technology itself is very much going the way of PCs and iPhones and calculators. It's a level playing field. So select the right people. Anyway, any questions or comments on that? I see something coming up on the screen here. Tim, somebody wrote there's no submit button, right? I'm not sure what this person is referring to.
That was with regard to the polling question. And no, you don't need to select it and then click a submit button. Just your selection will enter it in as a vote.
Now, let me just reference a couple of comments. Again, one of you had put client success and experience in finance and insurance. I can't see the rest of that. Let me open this up here. Insurance markets. That's kind of an interesting observation. Client success and experience in finance and insurance market. I would imagine that, and you know who posed this, I'll just use your first name, David. When you talk about finance and insurance markets, are you talking about managing the risk relationships? What do you mean in terms of that? If you could elaborate a little bit, I'd be happy to respond to that. In terms of the ability to interact with enterprise systems, Corinne wrote, would be the first priority. I take it you're talking about the ERP backend. You know, it's an interesting thing, Corinne, but it's almost like in the old days, cloud-based solutions were often referred to, and I consider a derogative reference point, as a bolt-on solution to a back-end ERP. And I think that what's interesting about that is that with the back-end ERP system, it was the dominant force within the organization itself. Well, now it's changing. It's almost turning into a tail wagging the proverbial dog. Although, when we look at cloud-based solutions, they're really becoming the driving force for the back-end rather than being an external extension or an adjunct function of the back-end. So, that's something that is really interesting. Is that it's no longer that bridge. I remember once looking at an Oracle implementation many years ago, and they said to bridge the gap between a front end and back end solution, if we didn't generate $1 million from it, we weren't interested in paying attention to it. Those were back in the days around 2000. So if you look at these elements here, the key is that the front-end solutions are very much becoming the driving force, and connectivity with the back-end is no longer as complex as it is. One more thing I'll touch on is David wrote risk relationships, controls, and security. But here's the thing. When you look at risk relationships, and that's becoming a key, one of the attendees at the conference, a firm called GRMS, specializes in risk assessment and filtering of suppliers, and had some very interesting data. In fact, a few months ago, they actually gave a webinar through ISM and Zycus. I'd encourage you to check that out, because that is something that is important. And what's important about what you had said is it goes beyond the traditional way of selecting and moving it from a realm of a technological issue, success in e-procurement, and it moves it into a relational issue. And I think that's really a key in terms of success. So hopefully that answers some of your question. Tim, how are we doing for time? We're doing pretty good, I would imagine.
It looks like we are, yes.
Good. Now, am I coming through clear to you, by the way? Everybody is able to hear me?
I believe so. We have one site that's having some issues, but it appears to be a bandwidth issue on their end.
Okay, great. Now, elevated role. Now, we hear, and this is the one thing, it's been a long-standing statement of we need to earn a seat at the executive table. It's almost like that face pressed against the window, looking inside, saying, how do I get in? And so when you talk about elevating the role of procurement, what exactly does that mean? Well, let's look at it this way, and we'll start with poll number 2, because I want your feedback on this. What is the best or most effective vehicle to elevate procurement's role, if indeed you believe it needs to be elevated? See, and we can cue the Jeopardy music now. But it feels like I'm watching election returns on the screen here. I love how those numbers are moving. Elevating the role. It's an interesting concept that seems to be forever on the table. Give it just a few more minutes.
It looks like the activity has died down to a crawl, so let's go ahead and share the results here.
Perfect. Well, this is an interesting thing. The two elements are education of others outside the profession on our value and contributions. I'm going to have something to say about that in a moment. And expansion of our focus outside of our traditional practice areas of comfort. And boy, do I have something to say about that as well. Now, let's start looking at this first of all. When you talk about education of others in terms of our practice and our focus, well, one of the interesting things, and I wrote an article about this many years ago, and they were talking about bridging the gap between finance and purchasing. And what was fascinating about that is that the study, and I believe it was through Aberdeen, came back and they said that by and large, finance or CFOs, the majority of them do not believe that procurement adds any real value to bottom line profitability. I don't have the percentages right in front of me, but I'm doing this from memory, but I can certainly provide them. So the vast majority of CFOs felt that procurement added very little value to bottom line profitability. They felt that procurement had very little influence on positioning the company for success. And I know this was many years ago, about 8-9 years ago. And I use that as a starting point because it's for me a place to look at and say, how far have we actually progressed? So when we talk about educating people outside of our realms, In what way do we have to educate them? Do we use the same metrics that we did before? Cost avoidance, for example, used to be a big terminology used in the procurement realm. All of those other areas which disconnected with how finance people viewed the success of the company. Did it have an impact on EBITDA? Did it have the return in terms of promoting share value of the organization? And so have we really progressed that far? And this leads into the second result, which was the expansion of our focus outside of our traditional practice areas or comfort zones. See, and this isn't just happening. I want to emphasize this. This isn't just happening in the world of procurement. It's happening in the world with CIOs and even the CFO world, where the functional silos with which we've become most familiar and comfortable are coming down. CIO Magazine ran a survey, and CIOs said, listen, we've got to change the way we work. We've got to redefine our roles. In fact, maybe we should even change our designation from CIO to something more holistic in terms of our impact on an enterprise or on our organization. The roles that have traditionally been established are being redefined, and new roles are being introduced. I mean, Chief Procurement Officer is one, but there's also RMOs, Relationship Management Officer, coming into the realm. And so I think before we seek to educate people on what we're doing, we have to make sure, what are we educating them on? What are we providing in the way of information, and how do they assess that value? Do we still have that bridge of disconnect where we feel we're doing something, but the organizations and the internal stakeholders we're serving, as well as the external stakeholders, but the internal stakeholders, are they seeing the value in the context of what's important to them? And I think that's key. And that's why, even more so, I think we have to expand our focus outside of the traditional realm. Now, I'm going to jump ahead here and there we go. So I posed this question, interestingly enough, as soon as it came out during the session on Twitter. I love Twitter because you get to chat live, and I caught it right back then. And one of the responses I immediately had was, why is procurement so afraid of risk? Now, remember that earlier question we had, or comment from an individual, is managing risk and being able to do that? Why is procurement so afraid of risk? Why are we not willing to go beyond the realms of a comfort zone? And that's really the key. Let me draw an example, and I made reference to the I-35 bridge. When I talked about the I-35 bridge, I don't know if you remember the bridge collapse in Minnesota. You probably do. And at that point in time, there was a sense of urgency to not only employ new architecture, but to rebuild the bridge on a timely fashion, not just in terms of restoring an important infrastructure, but also to honor those who had lost their lives in the tragedy, and do so in a manner that was cost effective. And this was all very unique because of the pressure, the crisis situation, that everyone got together. And so what the state of Minnesota did is they got together with the suppliers and the people they're going to work with to rebuild the bridge, and they literally abandoned their whole processes or standard processes of engagement, of risk sharing, everything, and worked on an open book framework where there was full transparency, and they shared the risk, and they worked together and collaborated, and they built a bridge using, again, I want to emphasize, new architecture, and built a bridge on time, on budget, and which was a phenomenal accomplishment. However, and there is an asterisk on this, the very next bridge project, they reverted back to their old ways of doing business. How do we manage risk? We got to, wear belts with suspenders. We got to dot the I's, cross the T's. They reverted back to their old ways. And the next bridge project they did ran 3 years overdue and over budget. Now, let me ask you this. When you go back to the poll results that we had talked about, and you talk about informing others as to how you deliver value, which example would you use to deliver the value of what procurement can do? And then there's another question that comes from there. Does procurement need a crisis to perform? Do we have to wait for a crisis to occur to get us to do the things that we are capable of versus the things with which we are most familiar and comfortable? The I-35 bridge project is just one example. There's many, many other examples, similar ones. And what that done is it meant that successful projects, successful initiatives, the success of the profession hasn't been scalable. It's been situational, and that situation has been driven by crisis. Can we, as a profession, operate outside of a crisis scenario to deliver those kinds of values and returns? Which end result would you want to be able to achieve? And I think that was the real point about elevating the profession. It's not talking about what we do. It's demonstrating what we do through collaboration, through building relationships that are built on transparency and understanding and insight and working towards a collective goal. And those end results, and one of the interesting things is, and this is Philip Eidson who responded by saying is, can we use the next crisis as a way to provide value as a platform position? I think what's interesting is I don't think we can wait for a crisis. I think we have to look for ways to do it now. Question is somebody, whether it be from the procurement ranks, whether it be from finance, whether it be from the IT ranks, somebody's going to come into the picture, and they are going to focus on building relationships and building a model of transparency to collaborate and lead that change. And that change is coming. Question is procurement equipped to do it? So when you talk about we want to promote ourselves, we want to educate others as to what we do, think about the scenario and think about what you're doing now and think about outcomes. And using the I-35 bridge example, what are your thoughts? Does it make sense? So that's the take that I got from elevating the level. Now, if you have any questions about those, for example, are you familiar with the I-35? Do you have examples similar to how procurement in a crisis situation has been able to shine? Then share it now in the Q&A. But I think we have to, when we consider elevating the role of the profession, I think we have to look beyond the familiar and look beyond that of what we know and are comfortable with, and look at the fact is, how do we deliver and how do we produce results? And do we have what it takes to lead the transformation in the way in which business is done? And I think that's really a key factor on it. Is it possible to do that? That could be a discussion for another day. So that's where we look at. Now, one more thing, and I think this is interesting, and it ties back into our commoditized cloud slide. Kelly Barner from Buyers Meeting Point responded, if the level of fear continues, there is no hope of procurement warming to automation. Now, I thought that was an interesting thing, because once again, the theme that came through the Zycus conference was that we are in a business about people and process and working together in collaboration. It isn't about technology. And that's the driving message, I think, that came through from this conference, is the realization, and there tends to be a realization, that we are moving in a direction that says we must be able to work together, and we have to redefine what we do as a profession before we can actually elevate it. So again, a very interesting comment, and technology, no matter how fantastic it is, isn't going to do it. Now, that leads into what I'm saying is responding to changes. By the way, Tim, I think everyone's going to get a copy on demand of these slides, correct? So I don't have to read through it, do I?
No, as a matter of fact, they can download them right now on the right side of your screen.
Perfect. Well, that's great. One thing, though, is we have to move away from what's known as zero-sum mindset. And I'll just make one more point on this. Whenever I travel, I open up a book, and there's the Karas School of Negotiation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but the mantra is, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. That is an adversarial zero-sum mindset that doesn't work. It isn't going to work on that basis. We have to become relational in our thinking. So if we want to, again, elevate the profession, think relational, think transparency, think working together. And somebody will say, well, my environment isn't necessarily conducive to that. And that may be the case. However, you have to look at making decisions at that point about your own personal choices and own personal careers as to how you want to do it. But realistically speaking, we have to move from this zero-sum mindset game where there is a winner and a loser, and have the right metrics in place to drive collaboration, greater collaboration. So that's my thoughts on it. Certainly welcome to hearing your thoughts. And again, remind you, you can join the tweet chat afterwards following this webinar to maybe expand further on this. Now, let's go to the next slide, highlight one. And this deals with one of the interesting things. I mentioned Philip Eidson beforehand. Is the profession headed for extinction? Are we indeed? I mean, I guess that's a mastodon. Do they call that a mastodon, Tim?
I think so.
Okay. Well, you see, you're my reference point here. So, okay, it's a big elephant, but I think it's a mastodon. Mm-hmm. Anyway, As we start with each section, let's start off with the poll here. Is procurement as a profession headed for extinction? Yes, no, not sure, other. There is no other, by the way, but I just wanted to see if you were paying attention. But anyway, take a few minutes and respond to that, as well as posting any questions you might have in terms of, or added comments you might have. You can post them. In the Q&A session and section and share them with us.
And Philip posted that it's a woolly mammoth, and I believe he's correct.
Okay, what's that? Okay, now you see. Now this is a digression that I have. Now, especially since the fifth cup of coffee has kicked in, what's the difference between a mastodon and a woolly mammoth? Well, I shouldn't ask that though, should I, Tim? Because that could confuse people.
It's probably subject for another webinar.
That's right. The woolly mammoth webinar, right?
Right.
Okay, so there's
we can close this. It looks overwhelming. No is the answer.
Yeah, saying no. Look at that. Now, here's an interesting point. With all the people that are attending, a certain percentage hasn't voted yet. If you haven't, get in there and vote. But everyone's saying no. So I got to ask the simple question. Why is that? And respond to the Q&A. I know it's for questions, but respond to the Q&A. Why do you say no? What is the reason for it? I mean, I think that's an interesting perspective that we have to investigate because things can happen and catch us off guard out of left field. Are we really doing all we can do to make an impression, to have an impact? Everyone's saying yes. I like seeing that, but again, maybe if you're so inclined, share the results from that. In the meantime, I'm going to move on and see what you have to say. But what were they thinking? Extinct. And I love this slide. And I'm only extracted a couple of slides from Phil's presentation. But how many remember Woolworths or Blockbuster or Borders? How many remember that? Do you honestly think that any of those individuals saw it coming, those companies, those organizations, that, you know what, we won't be here, we'll be gone? See, that's the whole point of this is if you think about it, where we are now, and saying, no, we're not going to be gone, what's the reasoning for it? What have we done to create and solidify our position of influence? Yes, procurement will always be around. People will always be purchasing. I'm not talking about the function. I'm talking about the role and the influence of procurement. And that's the key. And these examples that Phil provided, and there's also so many others of them. Such great names. To digress, there's a book by Jim Collins that I'm sure you've heard of called Good to Great, where he talks about the companies that made the transition from good to great, but he also mentioned companies that are no longer around. Names like Westinghouse, where are they? Texaco, and I know circumstances are different for each. But again, I like the Blockbuster reference because, at one point, Huizenga was everywhere, owned baseball teams and hockey teams, and, Blockbuster was a regular part of our lives. Now they're gone. How does somebody go from ubiquity and that type of market share to nothing? And that's the reason I posed this question is, these people never thought 5 years down the road that they would be gone. So what is propelling you? And just by asking yourself that question, even if you believe that we won't be gone, I think you'd have to admit that our roles are going to change dramatically. We have to look at ourselves. You know what I'll call it? I'll call it the Uberization of the profession. When you look at Uber, who thought that would be a viable model? And yet it came from a simple idea. Other ones, Amazon and Netflix. All of these factors, which, by the way, technology is driven in large part. I mean, let's face it, and see how they're all interconnected as well. And I'll go back to the commoditized cloud. The more simplified and more comfortable people are with technology, the more as we move towards the Internet of Things. And we're able to free ourselves up to become more strategic from the tasks. I won't say they're mundane, but some of them are, but necessary. And we're able to free ourselves up to focus and become more strategic. Are we ready to become more strategic? Are we adapting to the changes that are happening? I'm going to insert one comment here. Robert Hanfield wrote a book, and Gerard Chick wrote a book on procurement. And they're notable industry knowledge sources. And one of the comments that Hanfield has made is that there is a generational divide between procurement professionals of the past and today's emerging procurement professionals. And I know, Tim, we probably don't have the demographics of who's listening today, but here's the interesting thought on that, is that, there's a general feeling that the procurement professionals of today really don't have anything to learn from those who've been in the profession before. In other words, this clear divide. Kate Vitasek, who wrote Getting to We, was more blunt in a article she wrote in Forbes magazine, saying it's not until all the dinosaurs have died off that the profession will begin to fully emerge into its true capabilities. Now, I take a little exception to a dinosaur because, I'm a few years shy of 60, so I may be classified in that group. But I understand what she was saying, is that there are game changers that are happening. There are things that are happening that are redefining the way the profession does business. Unless we look at ourselves and do an honest appraisal of it and realize that no one is untouchable. Blockbuster wasn't untouchable. Well, where are they today? Netflix, the Amazon.coms, the Ubers, they're redefining business. Are we as a profession redefining how we do business? And that, I believe, was one of the main challenges of Phil's presentation. So again, 3 steps to save procurement, as he put it. Redefine our value proposition, or the perception of it. We talked about perception. And when you redefine perception, how you go about doing that. Embrace the coming disruption. Well, before you can embrace something, you have to be able to accept that it's happening. You have to be able to accept that you're vulnerable or that you're not bulletproof and that nothing lasts forever. And then you have to develop the capabilities to execute. So looking at all of these things that Phil was talking about, it was very compelling discussion. Now, I've got a few comments that are coming in. And I should have paid attention more because I didn't scroll down as quickly as I could. Let's just see. Mark wrote, it'll exist in one form or another. How far up the food chain is up to us? That's an interesting point. Paula wrote, procurement really is supply management. It is developing relationships with suppliers and partnerships. I can't argue with that. I think relationships, as I alluded to earlier, are going to become critically key. And she went on to add, we have to foster a collaborative environment. So in many ways, we're really kind of redefining our position through comments like that. We're moving from that zero-sum game, get the best price and reward. And I'll digress for another moment. Kate Vitasek had recounted a story in a presentation when she worked at Microsoft buying, how her incentives, she was paid for actually driving down supplier costs. And she said, she one day clicked that this is the wrong metrics. These are the wrong driving factors. We're hurting the relationship with the supplier. We're not improving ourselves. We may get a short-term gain, but the long-term pain from that is going to be hard. Well, have you had that kind of epiphany moment? I think that's really a key thing to consider. Antoine wrote, headed for extinction. If you run a project with external vendor for product setup, you'll notice the difference in time delay if you do it with procurement people or without. So, you know what, Antoine, I appreciate what you're saying there. If we're out of the picture, and I'll go back to a CPO agenda roundtable discussion of a number of years ago, where they brought together major executives from companies like Danone and organizations from around the world. And one of the interesting, or two of the interesting comments that came out, and they're almost contradicting, is they said the best person to run a purchasing department is someone who doesn't have a purchasing background. And that was an interesting thing. And whenever I speak in front of audiences, whether there's 20 or 700, I always look for the exit because I feel pitchforks and torches will be imminently coming out. But the reality is that was the general belief. And then another comment said that one strategic thinker in procurement is worth 12 common buyers. And this was a few years ago. So when you talk about the time delay and the difference, and the impact that procurement has in elevating the role and doing all of these things, Antoine, it would be very interesting to see the metrics that you have and the examples you've given, just like on the I-35 bridge, being able to substantiate that, being able to say, listen, this is the example that I actually have that I can share. Does indeed help to create that role that procurement can play and the adaptability we have in terms of that. Let me just continue on, share some more of these comments. They're all great comments, by the way. Let's see. John wrote, procurement, the profession is evolving. Procurement as we know it is changing from strict negotiations, cost savings, to one of education, business partner that provides value in terms of cost savings, risk management, contractual, legal, support, finance. I think that's true. That's part of the recognition that we have to redefine it. Now, some of you out there, and I wish I could do instantaneous polls based upon what John just wrote in that comment. How many of you feel that's representative of a new way or redefining our value proposition versus the old way of operating? Because that's going to have an impact on how you view things. Mike wrote, why do the roles need to change dramatically? What is changing to cause this? Well, you see, that's an interesting question. And we kind of touched on that, Mike, is that when we look at successes, we look at how do we create scalable successes. I'll use the I-35 bridge as an example because it's a good one, and it had a practical implication. I mean, you have one situation where procurement worked outside of its traditional boundaries to build a bridge that, using, again, new architectural techniques that it never built before, and do it through an open and collaborative, transparent framework, not a zero-sum game, and it was built on time, it was built on budget. And then as soon as they reverted back to the old ways of procurement, the standards, the dotting the I's, the crossing the T's, the belt with suspenders mindset approach. Now, I'm not advocating carelessness and throw caution to the wind, but I am talking about a very deliberate opportunity to work together. And I'll expand on that in a moment. I think that's where changes have to occur, because in that second bridge project, outside of the framework of a crisis situation, it went 3 years over budget and cost so much money. Now, I want to digress because the CEO, Tim Cummins of IACCM, once wrote an article that was contentious for some, but he had written in there that at the negotiating table, and it does begin at the top, at the negotiating table, stakeholders, individual stakeholders tend to lie to each other about what they can do, by when they can do it, and for how much they can do it. Or the old mindset of, let's win the business first and worry about making it work later. Now, I'm injecting that at this particular point in time, Mike, in response to you, because, again, that's the transparency that I believe John had referred to earlier. We have to change our minds about holding our cards close to our vest and begin to work on a collaborative basis so that the projects that we have, the successful projects, such as the I-35 bridge, aren't the exception to the rule, but become the rule. I mean, I hope that answered your question. I know I'm not looking for consensus or agreement here, but this is a worthwhile discussion and a question that you have raised. I've got a couple of more minutes before we have to go to the next one. I think, Tim, we're running pretty close to, I think I have about 17 minutes left, right?
That's about right.
Okay, so let me see what else I have. Scrolling down here. Okay, a couple of people actually agree. Good. This is interesting. Paula again wrote, the I-35 bridge example is where the technology issue happened. Tim, can you give me the Cliff Notes takeaway to put, oh, never mind. Sorry about that. Okay. Anyway, let's look over here. Okay. Alex wrote, the procurement profession is headed to extinction simply because negotiations are no longer a key factor. This is even a more apparent factor within MNC's business environments, which is budget-oriented. Strategy is sadly no longer required. Well, you see, now that's an interesting point. I don't think, when you talk about strategy, I don't think strategy is not required. I just think it has to be refocused on accomplishing shared goals or objectives. I agree with you. Negotiations, and it's an interesting thing. I once read a paper on negotiating styles of the millennial generation and Generation X compared to baby boomers, and certainly there were distinctions there. But this idea of a negotiation to win, I'm going to give you a little story here. And it's about, I call it my orange juice and marmalade story. There's a brother and sister who were arguing over an orange. And the mother came to try to settle. And the mother said, well, to the brother, what do you want the orange for? And the brother said, I'd like orange juice. And the sister, she asked, what do you want the orange for? And the sister said, I'd like to make marmalade. So here's one orange and two people fighting over it. That's the mindset that we traditionally have had in the procurement world. The mother turned around and said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we take the rind from the orange, which goes into the making of marmalade, and you can have your marmalade, and then we'll cut the orange in half and make orange juice so you'll have your own orange juice. The same end objective in terms of the results for each the brother orange juice, the sister marmalade, doesn't have to be the same, but it doesn't mean that they can't get their realized value out of the same situation or relationship. And that orange marmalade story I like because it talks about the fact that it isn't an either or. Somebody wins, somebody loses. And I think that's really the key, Alex, is that when you negotiate, you have to look at having not only an understanding of what you want to accomplish, but where the profession evolves, I'll use that as a term, we look beyond that and we say, okay, what does the other party get from the relationship? We're no longer dealing with these blinders on of saying, if only we do what we need to do, then we've been successful. Because in the procurement world that's emerging, in the world of business relationships that are emerging, win-win has to be more than a wonderful sentiment or tree-hugging type of terminology that does nothing more than make people feel good. We have to actually practice it. So that's my answer in terms of that. Now, I'm going to have to move on to the next slide, but I have to tell you, Philip's post and presentation was good. I'd encourage you to check out his Art of Procurement radio show. Some great things on there. Now, blockchain and federated trust model. And one of the things that Gartner said, which I found very interesting, was federated trust model is the key to blockchain, according to Gartner, to bring it into the biz world. So I'm going to start off by doing this. And here's another poll, and it's the fourth and final. Are you familiar with blockchain's role in the business world? So, Tim, if you want to run those numbers there, please. And let's see what we're doing. Love these live responses. Mm-hmm. By the way, anyone, feel free to put in the Mastodon Woolly Mammoth answer. See, that's going to bug me now.
Mary did say, I like animals. I have a woolly Bichon dog. And they are still roaming the earth to this day.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mary. I appreciate that. See, Tim, you don't know the answer either, though, so I don't feel so bad. Right?
I don't.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go ahead and close this and share the results. And almost 2/3 of the audience say no.
I see, that's an interesting thing. Now, you know what, and by the way, and Tim, and I'm sure everyone's seeing, you see the ripple effect of what our discussion is happening today? The impact of one, how do you elevate the role of procurement? What are the things to prevent us from going extinct and all of these elements? These are one of the changes that are happening along the line of Netflix and the Amazon example. So let's do this. What I'm going to do is I am going to move to the next slide, and I've got a video. Videos are always nice. So we'll cue up the video, and this will give you a very quick explanation as to what blockchain is.
Blockchain is peer-to-peer software technology that protects the integrity of a digital piece of information. It was invented to create the alternative currency Bitcoin, but may be used for other cryptocurrencies, online signature services, voting systems, and many other applications. In this video, we explain how it works and what makes it special. Everyone uses paper money. When you get a $10 bill, you trust that it's not fake. If instead someone sent you an email saying, "Here's $10, you probably wouldn't trust it. But when we transfer money, use an ATM, or pay with a deposit card, that's pretty much exactly what we do. We're sending money and a digital message. To make sure no one's cheating or sending money they don't have, these messages go through a few trusted banks that keep a record of everything. They know how much money everyone has and deduct it properly for every transaction. But this becomes expensive when there's a million transactions around the world every minute. The Economist estimates that banks charged us more than $1.7 trillion to process these payments in 2014. That's about 2% of the entire world economy. With blockchain, we can save a lot of this cost because it lets us send money just like sending an email. Instead of sending a lot of payment information through a few servers, blockchain uses thousands of personal computers on the internet. All transactions are copied and cross-checked between every computer in a system-wide accounting book called the ledger, which becomes very safe at scale. Blockchain doesn't just allow us to create safe money online, it lets us protect any piece of digital information. This could be online identity cards, voter ballots, contracts, and many other legal instruments, bringing bureaucracy into the 21st century.
And there you have the video. Now, let me ask you this quickly in there. And by the way, because I'm going to lose these answers as more comments come in, I want to thank Philip, for telling us that both animals were herbivores. I don't know if I said that right. And that the mastodon was a relative of the woolly mammoth. So now, Tim, I can go to sleep tonight and not have this over there. Yeah, see, I knew that was weighing heavily on you as well. I could sense it over the waves. Anyway, now, looking at that video now, and maybe make some comment in there. Now that you've seen that, do you see what blockchain is about? Do you understand what it can do? And even more importantly, and share this in the Q&A section, is do you see its impact, or what do you think its impact will be on procurement? I want to see some of the answers start coming in here. I'm going to pause here because it'll segue nicely into the Gartner executive comment that blockchain technology is overhyped right now, and why there was the reference to the what you call the federated trust model. But just if you could share a few thoughts now that you've seen the video. I got very interesting on that. Do you have a better idea as to how it can impact the procurement world, and in what way? It is about risk, Paula says. Very interesting on that. In terms of risk, I would imagine the assumption is there greater risk without a federated trust? And I'm going to get into what a federated trust is. Or is it a more risk-free environment? And we're not talking about just the exchange of money, but documents, contracts, and things along that line. Shane indicated may allow freelance procurement. That's an interesting term. I've never heard about freelance procurement before. You know what? I think that's the subject. I'm going to write this down. I think that'll be the subject of another webinar. Freelance procurement. Great one there. I'm going to have to look into that. Faster movement. Philip comes back with faster movement of money, promote trade financing, which is becoming a key factor as well. We didn't touch on this here today, but supply chain financing and the impact that it has, not just in terms of the expedited payment of funds, but the actual output of quality. I'm going to digress for just 1 second here. There's an automotive industry study that came out that talked about the fact that the suppliers who are happiest with the clients to whom they sell in the automotive industry, those clients are able to produce better products on a cheaper basis. And the big auto manufacturers in North America had struggled a little bit with supplier satisfaction, but financing definitely does come into the equation there. So a good point that you're bringing up. Yes, suppliers should receive payments faster with less paperwork. And let's see, one person there. Elizabeth said that her company still sends out checks to all vendors, and the reason is because it's too expensive to do ACH or electronic funds transfer. That's interesting. So how would we explain that it's more beneficial to do this sort of blockchain technology than going about paper money? See, so that's an interesting point. Is it in fact really more expensive? I haven't seen any reports that have suggested that e-transfer or electronic transfers are more expensive. In fact, I think they're more convenient and less expensive. And I'm going to relate this back to a personal experience, because, as we talk about the e-commerce world and B2C and B2B, and I know I may be taking off on a little bit of a detour here, but one of the things that procurement professionals said with regards to e-commerce is that we want a similar experience at work to what we have at home when we buy at home for ourselves personally and when we transact business. For example, when I pay bills now, I don't write checks anymore. I pay everything online. I pay things by e-transfers. If I have to pay a soccer fee or something along those lines, e-transfers. They make it so much easier and instantaneous, and they create an electronic audit trail, so less paper involved, less filing, less management. So Elizabeth, I'm not disputing what you're saying, but I'd have to see more specific numbers in terms of that, simply because I would think that it would lessen the paperwork. But you're not alone. Kyle, for example, we also use paper checks because AP believes ACH is more expensive. You got to ask, what is that based on from a logical standpoint? And I'm not advocating blockchain or what you would call the federated trust models, but they're coming. That's the reality of it. More and more organizations are making that movement towards it. So, and Paula mentioned about risk of hacking and cybersecurity, cybercrime, both domestic and international issues. I think one of the things that I would say, and it doesn't make it any less worrisome, Paula, is that hacking and things along that lines, and I think you probably remember maybe about a month or so ago when Facebook went down, I think Twitter had some problems. It was because somebody had hacked in. I spoke with Richard Steen and actually interviewed him, and he wrote Surviving Cyber War, which is a very interesting book, and you may want to read that. And he talked about the fact that the hacks and what happens even at the Pentagon on a daily basis. There are breaches of that. So I think because of how we operate now in an interconnected world in the virtual realms, I think that this is a risk element. And the cyber hacking with any new technology, there's always elements of risk. When photocopiers first came out, and then the color photocopiers first came out, making photocopies of money, documents, all of these things. I mean, there's always going to be an element of I was going to say subversion, but there's going to be an element to corruptible element that'll create risk. But that's going to be with anything. That shouldn't keep us locked into where we are. We need to look at where technology is going and adapt to that as well going forward. But these are good points. Anyway. What's interesting about Gartner, and I see we've got only a couple of minutes left, is they said it was overhyped. And the point that they were making, and this is a description, this is a perfect slide if you want to understand it. A federated trust internet basically replaces the banking institutions, and it creates a trust relationship and may address your risk factors that you were talking about, Paul, in terms of setting up a secure way to transact business. Again, we've got like 2 minutes left, so I don't want to dwell too much on this, but check this out because this explains to you how it works in a secure environment. And that's why Gartner was saying the hype regarding blockchain it's overhyped until they get into these trust federations. And those are key terms that you're going to have to know as procurement professionals, not just blockchain, but what is a trust federation? It's an identity meta system, as they call it. Well, I've provided the links to these, so you can look at it. And again, instead of banks, a trust federation is in the lines of iBrokers and their customers who agree to abide by a common set of agreements. So there is a way, and I don't want to use the term localize the engagement to reduce risk, but there are models that are being put in place. And that's why Gartner said trust federations are the key to elevating blockchain technology where it has to go. But pay attention to that because blockchain is going to be a big thing. Now, we got 2 minutes left. Any general questions and answers, or if you disagree with anything I said, please share that because I'm not looking for consensus. The purpose of webinars and the opportunity for us to come together today is that we can create a dialogue. So if there's any other questions or comments on anything you've seen today, I'm going to open the floor. And as we do that, because time is ticking, and I'll look for your questions, you can join us after the webinar tweet chat. I can't say that fast 3 times, though, Tim. Tweet twat. It's like saying fruit flow 3 times. Haven't you had fun today, Tim?
We have. It's been a great program. And I can't believe we don't have a ton of questions.
Well, what's good is that they were asking, I got to tell you, I love the dialogue. The screen was filling up with the Q&A comments and some questions. On the screen, there is Horizon 16 chat where we can expand on it. Now, Mary wrote, this is interesting. Where is it? I may have hit the wrong button here. Let's see. There we go. Oh, good discussion. But thank you, Paula. Mary wrote, different outcome than I thought. I'd be interested in, share your opinions. I imagine at the exit, there's like exit polls. I imagine there's exit comments where people can submit questions or make comments about the time we spent together. Right, Tim?
That's right.
So why don't I do this? We've got 1 minute left, maybe 30 seconds. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me the opportunity to share this hour. Hopefully you found great value in it, and it's not along the lines of there's an hour of my life I won't get back. But thank you for sharing the time. Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, and John, I want to thank you for a very informative and entertaining presentation today. On behalf of the Institute for Supply Management and Zycus, I want to thank our audience for joining us and participating in today's event. That concludes our program today. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.